The conference room was alive with voices, a low hum of chatter and the steady clicking of keyboards filling the air when my phone lit up with Mark's name. For a moment I almost smiled, expecting the usual, a quick check-in, maybe a question about when I'd be home. But the second I stepped into the hallway and pressed the phone to my ear, his voice cut through sharp and cold like a blade I never saw coming. "Elena," he said, not a trace of warmth left. "I'm divorcing you. And by the way, I've already sold the house. You'll need to figure out where you're going to live." Then came the laugh, dry, mocking, as if I were nothing more than a naive fool who had just been checkmated. For a split second I couldn't breathe. The audacity of it, the cruelty wrapped in such casual words, made my stomach twist. My hand clenched around the phone as if I could squeeze the arrogance right out of him. "You sold the house?" I asked, my voice steady, though my chest was pounding. "Yeah," he replied smugly. "Samantha and I need the money. She deserves better than a cramped little place like that." Samantha. Hearing her name out loud was like a slap across the face. I had suspected for months his late nights, his unexplained absences, but to hear him say it so easily, so shamelessly, felt like he had ripped open my chest with his bare hands. And still somehow I refused to give him the pleasure of hearing me break. "My name is Elena Carter." I remind myself, as if to anchor my own identity. In that moment, I am 35 years old. I have built my career as an interior architect from the ground up, and for 7 years I believed I was building a life with a man I could trust. But now, standing in that sterile hallway with his laughter still ringing in my ear, I realized that Mark hadn't just betrayed me. He wanted to erase me, to strip me of my dignity, my home, even my place in the world. We had once promised each other. A wave of fury rose beneath the calm surface of my voice, and though my lips curved into what might have sounded like composure, when I answered inside, I was already fighting not to collapse under the weight of humiliation and rage. I stood there in the hallway, my back pressed against the cold wall, the phone still warm in my hand, even after he hung up. The fluorescent lights above hummed sharp and merciless, and for a moment it felt like the entire world had tilted on its axis. My coworkers were only a few steps away, laughing, flipping through binders, sipping burnt coffee from paper cups, oblivious to the fact that my marriage had just been split open in the ugliest way possible. I forced myself to walk back into the conference room, sit through presentations, nod at the right moments. All the while my chest felt heavy with the echo of Mark's laughter. It was almost comical how easily he delivered the words that upended everything we had built. Almost, but not quite. On the flight back to Denver, later that evening, I stared out the oval window at the endless sprawl of clouds. My reflection in the glass looked foreign, tired eyes, clenched jaw, the faintest tremor in my hand as I adjusted the thin airline blanket over my knees. For 7 years I had been Mark Sullivan's wife. We bought that house together, a modest 2-story in an old neighborhood with elm trees lining the sidewalks. I remembered the way I fell in love with the creaky wooden stairs, the sun-drenched kitchen with windows that overlooked a backyard big enough for a garden. To me, it was more than property. It was proof that we had survived the chaos of our 20s, his debts, my late nights, drafting floor plans, the endless compromises. It was a promise made real. But to him it was just collateral, just another chip to cash in when he got bored. The truth is, Mark had always been restless. Back when we first met, his charm was magnetic, his confidence disarming. He made me feel safe at a time when my own life was uncertain. But cracks had always been there, hairline fractures I chose to ignore. The late-night poker games that meant nothing. The lies about small debts that turned into bigger ones. I thought marriage would steady him, that he'd see the home we built as an anchor. Instead, it seemed to suffocate him. And maybe I wasn't blameless. Years ago, when the debt collectors started calling, I made a decision without asking. I sold his old car, the Mustang he adored, but could never keep running. I told myself it was necessary, that saving our future meant sacrificing his nostalgia. He forgave me with words, but not with his heart. That wound lingered hidden beneath his easy smile, festering until it became an excuse to resent me. Now he had Samantha. Young, eager, full of energy he once admired in me. I imagined her wide-eyed hanging on his stories, convinced she was building a future with a man ready to conquer the world. She didn't know him the way I did. She didn't know how he skimmed paperwork signed, without reading, gambled away paychecks, spun charm into excuses. To her he was bold. To me he was reckless. And now that recklessness had turned cruel. He wanted to wipe me out of the picture entirely, to erase my name from the life we'd carved. As the plane rattled through turbulence, I tightened the seatbelt across my lap and closed my eyes. Anger curled in my stomach, sharp and bitter, but beneath it was something steadier, colder. He thought I was powerless, that I would collapse under the humiliation of betrayal. But Mark never truly understood me. He never noticed the details. I stored quietly away, the quiet resolve I learned from years of being underestimated. If he thought his call had broken me, he hadn't seen what I was capable of when I finally decided enough was enough. By the time the plane touched down in Denver, the anger inside me had hardened into something sharper, almost like clarity. I dragged my suitcase across the terminal, ignoring the buzz of texts and emails, my mind already tracing the next move. I wasn't going to let Mark write the ending to my story. As I stepped into the crisp night air outside the airport, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the one name I trusted with my life, Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been my friend long before either of us wore suits to work. Back in college, he was the one who pulled all-nighters with me at the library, who shared instant noodles and dreams about the lives we would one day build. Now, he was one of the most meticulous attorneys I knew, a man who believed in details the way some people believed in religion. When he picked up, his voice was brisk, but warm. "Elena, what's going on?" For the first time since that phone call, my voice didn't shake as I laid it all out. The divorce announcement, the so-called sale of our house, the mention of Samantha. I could hear him pause on the other end, the silence taut with disbelief, before he finally said, "He can't sell the house. Not legally, not without your signature. You still have the deed in your name, don't you?" I slipped into the back seat of a cab, the city lights blurring past the window, and whispered almost with a strange sense of pride, "Yes, it's been in my name since the refinancing." He signed off on it, never even bothered to read what he was signing. I could hear the smile in Daniel's voice when he replied, "Then he's in deep trouble, Elena. If he's taken money from anyone under false pretenses, that's fraud. You're standing on solid ground." As the cab wound its way through the familiar streets, I thought about that paperwork, the moment months ago when I insisted the deed be transferred solely to me. At the time, it felt like a small act of protection, a precaution against Mark's spending habits. He had laughed it off, barely skimming the documents before scribbling his name at the bottom. That arrogance, that carelessness, now it was the very thing that would undo him. When I finally walked through the front door of our house, the silence wrapped around me like a stranger. His shoes were still kicked carelessly by the entryway, his jacket hanging on the back of a chair as if he still owned the space. I stood in the living room, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet, and for the first time I didn't feel comfort. I felt ownership, the kind that came with proof and paperwork, not promises. This was mine, and no amount of his lies could erase that. Daniel called again the next morning, his voice clipped with the efficiency I had always admired. He told me he'd already begun drafting a formal letter to Mark, one that laid out exactly where he stood nowhere. The house wasn't his to sell. The so-called buyer had already been contacted, and any further attempt to meddle would only dig his hole deeper. "Let him stew," Daniel said, and I found myself almost smiling at the thought. For years, Mark had played the part of the confident husband, the man who always knew more than me, who dismissed my worries with a pat on the head. Now the roles were shifting, and I was the one holding the cards he didn't even know existed. Still, beneath the satisfaction, there was a raw ache I couldn't shake. This was the man I had once loved, the man whose laugh used to fill these walls, whose touch once calmed my restless nights. Now he was the enemy, and I was preparing for battle. I stood in the kitchen, the morning light spilling across the counters, and wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. My reflection in the glass door of the oven looked back at me, steady, tired, but unbroken. If Mark thought I would roll over, he had no idea who I really was. It didn't take long for the storm to arrive. 2 evenings later, just as the sky outside dipped into that deep purple before nightfall, I heard the front door slam open. The sound ricocheted through the house, jarring and violent like the crack of thunder before a downpour. Mark stood there, his face flushed red, his phone clutched so tightly in his fist I thought it might shatter. His eyes found me in the living room, and in an instant the air between us grew heavy thick with the weight of all the words we hadn't yet said. "What the hell is this?" he barked, waving the screen at me. I didn't need to look to know it was Daniel's letter. His voice was sharp, jagged, laced with panic he was trying and failing to mask with anger. "You're telling me I can't sell the house. You think you can just cut me out of what's mine?" I didn't move from where I stood, arms folded across my chest, my heart beat steady, though my hands trembled faintly under the weight of his rage. "It's not yours to sell, Mark," I said evenly. "The deed has been in my name since last year. You signed the paperwork yourself. Or did you not bother to read it like always?" For a moment his expression faltered. Confusion flickered across his features before the sneer returned desperate and brittle. "That's bullshit. We bought this house together. I've paid for it. I've lived here. It's half mine, whether you like it or not." He jabbed his finger toward the floorboards as if the house itself might rise up and confirm his claim. I reached behind me and pulled the manila folder I'd prepared earlier. The deed clipped neatly inside and laid it flat on the coffee table between us. The sound of the folder hitting the wood was louder than it should have been, final, unshakable. "See for yourself," I told him. "Your signature, your choice. You gave it away because you didn't care enough to pay attention, and now you can't undo that." His breath hitched, his bravado faltering for just a beat before he doubled down, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You think you're so damn smart, don't you? This doesn't change anything. I already made a deal, and you're going to look like a fool when it all falls apart." I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. "The sale is already void, Mark. The buyer knows it, and if you've touched a dime of that deposit, you've committed fraud. Do you even realize how much trouble you're in?" For the first time, his confidence cracked. His eyes darted away from mine, his jaw tightening, and he muttered, "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about." My voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper than any shout could have. "You've spent years treating me like I was too naive, too soft to notice the games you played. But you've underestimated me, Mark. And now you're the one backed into a corner." He stopped pacing and stared at me, his breathing heavy, his face twisted into something raw and ugly. For a long moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then he laughed, short, bitter, almost unhinged. "You think you've won just because you've got some paper and a lawyer in your pocket. You don't know what I'm capable of." I took a step closer, not breaking eye contact, the steady thud of my pulse keeping rhythm with my words. "No, Mark. I know exactly what you're capable of. Lies, manipulation, empty promises. But this time, none of that is going to save you." The confrontation that night left the house charged with a strange silence, like the air after lightning has ripped across the sky. For 2 days, Mark didn't come home, though. His shoes and jackets remained scattered by the door like stubborn reminders that he thought this place was still his. I used those days to put things in order, clearing the counters of his clutter, boxing up documents, making sure every piece of proof I had was lined up and ready. I told myself it was only a matter of time before he tried something reckless again, and I was right. On the 3rd evening, I heard the front door click open softer, this time almost careful. I set down the papers I'd been reviewing at the dining table, bracing myself, and when I looked up, it wasn't just Mark who walked in. His hand was linked with hers, Samantha. She was younger than me, with perfectly styled hair, a tailored coat, and the smug kind of smile that only comes when someone thinks they've won. She stepped into the living room like she was inspecting property she already owned, her arm curled around his as though to stake her claim. "So this is where we'll be staying," she said lightly, her eyes sweeping over the walls, the furniture, the very air of the place. Her voice dripped with entitlement as though I was already a ghost in my own home. I rose slowly, every nerve in my body taut, my palms pressed flat against the edge of the table to steady myself. My heart hammered, but my voice was steel when I spoke. "No, Samantha, this is where Mark was staying. You won't be staying here at all." Her smile faltered just slightly, as if she'd misheard me. She glanced up at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. Mark's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he turned to me. "What is this performance, Elena? You can't throw us out. This is my house too." I took a deliberate step forward, sliding the folder from the table and holding it against my chest like a shield. "It's not your house, not anymore. The deed has been in my name for over a year. You signed it, remember? Or were you too busy skimming the pages to notice what you were giving away?" He froze, the color draining from his face, and in that hesitation I saw Samantha's expression shift. She looked from me to him, her brows knitting together. "What is she talking about, Mark? You told me this was your place. You said you sold it." His hand twitched at his side, his words coming out too fast, too thin. "It's complicated. Don't listen to her, I can explain." But I cut him off before he could spin another lie. My voice was calm, sharp, unwavering. There's nothing complicated about it. Mark tried to sell a house that doesn't belong to him. He took a deposit under false pretenses, which is fraud. And the buyer already knows the sale is void. If he doesn't return the money, he'll be facing charges. Samantha's mouth fell open. She took a step back, clutching her designer purse tighter against her body as though she could shield herself from the reality unfolding in front of her. "Fraud," she whispered, her eyes snapping to Mark wide with dawning horror. "Tell me you didn't drag me into this. Tell me you didn't lie to me about everything." He reached for her arm, his voice frantic now. "Sam, listen, I'll fix it. I just need time." She yanked herself away, shaking her head, her voice rising. "Time? You promised me security. You promised me a future. And all this time you were lying to me too." Her gaze flicked back to me, sharp and cutting, as if to measure the depth of the betrayal. But I didn't flinch. I stood firm, my eyes locked on her until she let out a bitter laugh and muttered, "Unbelievable." Then she turned on her heel and walked straight out the door, the sharp click of her heels fading down the hall until silence swallowed the house again. Mark's face collapsed as the door slammed shut, all the bravado draining from him in an instant. He spun back toward me, his voice breaking between anger and desperation. "You didn't have to do that, Elena. You didn't have to humiliate me in front of her." I held his gaze, my fingers tightening on the folder in my hands, and for the first time in years I felt taller than him, stronger than the man who had once made me feel so small. "You humiliated yourself, Mark." I just finally let the truth do the talking. The silence after Samantha's footsteps faded was crushing, heavier than any scream he could have thrown at me. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, shoulders sagging, his chest rising and falling like he had just run a marathon. His hands trembled at his sides, his lips parted as if searching for words, but nothing came. For years he had been the one with the sharp tongue, the quick retorts, the charm that could spin lies into silk. Now all of that was gone, stripped bare until there was only a man cornered by his own arrogance. Finally his voice cracked low and raw, almost unrecognizable. "Elena, please. I screwed up. I know I did. But you don't have to do this. You don't have to throw everything away." His eyes darted around the room, landing on the pictures still hanging on the wall, the books stacked neatly on the shelves, the faint scent of dinner lingering from the night before. It was as if he was seeing it all for the first time, realizing what he had lost, only when it was already out of his grasp. I walked past him, calm and deliberate, and set a folder down on the coffee table between us. This time it wasn't the deed. It was a fresh set of papers neatly clipped together, the kind that carried a finality no one could ignore. "I don't have to do this, Mark," I said, my voice steady as I looked him in the eye. "But I will. This is the divorce paperwork. My lawyer has already prepared everything. You can sign it now or you can drag it into court. Either way, this ends tonight." He stared at the folder as if it were a live wire, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw fear instead of arrogance. "After everything, after 7 years, you really hate me that much?" His voice broke on the last words, a plea, a pathetic attempt to turn the blame back on me. "Hate you?" I let out a laugh, soft and bitter, the kind that carried no joy. "No, Mark, I don't hate you. I pity you. You had everything. Someone who loved you, a home we built together, a life full of second chances, and you threw it all away because you couldn't see past your own ego. That's not hate. That's sadness for the man you chose to become." He sank onto the couch, his hands buried in his hair, his whole frame collapsing inward. "Where am I supposed to go?" he whispered, his voice small, stripped of all the bravado that once defined him. I didn't flinch, didn't soften. I had carried his burdens long enough. That's not my problem anymore. "Pack your things, Mark, tonight. By tomorrow I want you out of this house, out of my life, out of every corner you've poisoned." He looked up at me one last time. Eyes rimmed, red lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Slowly, like a man defeated, he rose to his feet, grabbed his coat from the chair, and walked to the door. His movements were heavy, dragging, as though each step took more than he had left to give. When the door finally closed behind him, the sound echoed through the house, sharp and clean, like the final strike of a gavel. I stood in the center of the room, the weight of years pressing down on me, then lifting all at once. The house felt different, lighter, as though it had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. My chest ached, not from grief, but from the strange, liberating clarity of knowing it was over. The man who had once laughed as he tried to erase me was gone, and in his absence I felt the quiet power of a life finally reclaimed. The night after Mark left, the silence in the house was deafening, but not in the way it used to be. It wasn't the silence of tension, of waiting for footsteps at the door, of wondering which version of him would walk in. This silence was clean, sharp, almost holy. I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, staring at the space where his oversized gaming chair used to be, the wall once cluttered with framed jerseys, now bare. For years those things had felt like intrusions, pieces of him that took up space without asking. Now their absence felt like air rushing into lungs that had been starved too long. Over the next few days I began to reclaim the house piece by piece. I moved the furniture around, hung up prints I'd bought years ago but never displayed because he'd called them pretentious. I filled the kitchen with fresh flowers, let the smell of coffee linger in the mornings without worrying about his complaints. I opened the windows wide and let the Colorado air sweep through the rooms, carrying out the stale remnants of his presence. It wasn't just redecorating. It was rewriting the script of my life, one small, deliberate choice at a time. Rachel came over one evening, arms full of takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes of his things, taping them shut with quick, satisfying swipes of packing tape. She held up one of his ties, smirking. "He doesn't deserve a single corner of this place anymore." I laughed, real laughter this time, bubbling up from somewhere that had been locked tight for too long. For the first time in months, I felt the weight on my chest ease, replaced with something lighter, freer. Daniel called a week later to tell me the divorce paperwork had been filed without any pushback. "He doesn't have a leg to stand on," he said, his voice steady with quiet triumph. "You're free, Elena. Officially." That word "free" hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the legal tie cut loose. It was years of resentment, of compromise, of letting myself be smaller so he could feel bigger. It was all gone now, dissolved into nothing but a lesson I would never forget. One night I found myself standing on the back porch, a mug of tea warming my hands as the sky over the Rockies shifted from gold to violet. The garden I once dreamed of planting was still just bare soil. but for the first time, I could see it clearly in my mind. Rows of lavender, maybe tomatoes, maybe a small fountain in the corner. The possibilities stretched out before me, like the horizon itself wide and untouchable. I thought about the woman I had been when Mark first called me from that smug, cruel distance. A woman who felt like the rug had been pulled from under her feet. And then I thought about the woman I was now still standing unbroken, holding the keys not just to the house but to my own life. He had laughed once, certain that he'd stripped me of everything. But in the end, his arrogance was his undoing, and my silence, my steadiness, had been the weapon he never saw coming. I took a deep breath, the night air cool and sharp in my lungs, and whispered to myself, "This is mine now. My home. My life. My freedom." And for the first time in years, I believed it with every part of me.